You are going to behave. Do you understand? If you don't behave, oh, hi everybody. Welcome to History with Mr. E. Today, what? No. And no more talking and interrupting. He wants, Tater Jr. wants to give the lecture, and I'm just not going to let it happen. I've had enough of his stinking mouth for today. Today, we're going to talk about how our country changed after the 1950s. It's 22.1, testing traditional values, and what happened to our country. What happened to our country after World War II and after the 1950s? Secular humanism, which meant a non-Christian, religion-free, moral philosophy that thought that man was the highest being around, became popular. It became prevalent in school curriculums, so schools were teaching about this. It permitted this thing called follow your animal instincts and behave like you would instinctually behave. It left morals behind. You know what morals are? The understanding of right and wrong and the rules that we live by, right? It allowed you to express yourself the way you wanted to. No one got educated this way. No decent human beings were brought up this way. Because if you were allowed to do anything you want, then how would you ever learn to do what you actually need? In 1962, a woman named Madalyn Murray O'Hair, a communist and an atheist, used her teenage son William to protest Bible reading and prayer in public schools. She hated God because atheists don't just not believe in God, they hate God and want God removed from society. She protested Bible reading and prayer in public schools when most schools would have prayer to open their day, would read scriptures, would acknowledge, the value of Christianity in our society. And she used her son to say that this was wrong and took her protests all the way to the Supreme Court, and they removed prayer and Bible reading in the schools in 1962. In 1963, it became illegal, and you were discriminated against if you were a Christian in these schools. This marked a moral decline in America, the removal of godly values from the upbringing of children, public education, and opened the door for a spirit of rebellion. In 1962, the worst rules that were broken in school were chewing gum or talking in the hallways or running in the hallways. And then by the 1970s, drug use, sexual immorality, violence were the problems we were facing in schools. And they've continued since then to get worse. Of course, this also marked the era of the birth of Christian schools, because people wanted an alternative to these dreadful, godless public schools. Since the 1920s, a group of lawyers called the American Civil Liberties Union, mostly atheists, was formed, and they would defend the rights of extreme views on atheism, socialism, and communism, and try to fight against Christianity and morality in America. They forced the separation of church and state onto many aspects of human lives in American culture. The new president, LBJ, after JFK was assassinated, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was reelected in 1964, and he had a program called the Great Society. I think that was a continuation of JFK's New Frontier program and FDR's New Deal program, and it just pushed welfare, more and more welfare, and turned the United States into a welfare state, which is fairly close to socialism. Schools began to get federal money when schools used to only be run by states. They began to get federal money. It started new programs like Job Corps, Head Start, and Medicare, some of which is good, some of which is ludicrous and bad. I'll let you decide that for yourself. Of course, this is the era of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited racial discrimination in all public places. The 24th Amendment prohibited poll taxes. Could you imagine having to go pay to vote? That was a way that they kept a lot of poor and people from voting, and a lot of poor people were black people. There was the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that required federal supervision of local elections to cut down on corruption in these elections. It increased the black voter registration by 40%, so that's a good thing. They developed the Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD, which we have in Glasgow and Teeville, HUD houses. The director, Robert Weaver, the director of HUD, was the first black American cabinet member ever. The first black Associate Justice of the Supreme Court was Thurgood Marshall. These are all good things. There's no point in discriminating against somebody because of their race. Everybody, this is America. It's a capitalist society. We can make what we can of ourselves through hard work, determination, education. It's our right to try to make something of ourselves, not to be discriminated against because we're a different race. In 1968, we came up with the Fair Housing Act that made it illegal to discriminate when renting a house or selling houses based on race, religion, etc. That changed a lot of cities and a lot of towns, because there was certain towns where a white person was the only type of person allowed to live there. I mean, even in Glasgow, there are white regions and black regions. There are white churches and black churches, white funeral homes and black funeral homes. And now those are more traditional, than required. But back then, if you were black, you couldn't go to a white funeral home if you died. If you didn't go to a white church, you didn't live in a white neighborhood, you didn't eat at a white restaurant, you didn't drink from a white water fountain or go in a white public restroom. It's just the way it was, and I'm glad it's changed. There was a prominent black leader named Malcolm X. He was a supremacist, a black supremacist, and he called for black power. He called for segregation, and complete segregation of white culture and black culture in order to preserve the black culture. He was a Muslim, but he was actually murdered by rival Muslims because the Muslim religion is a religion of violence and hatred and murder. And don't let anybody tell you any different. Malcolm X was not a good politician. He supported violence and racial separation, but he's been made into a symbol of black pride by people who don't understand what he really supported. Martin Luther King Jr. left a great legacy of nonviolence. He was the opposite of Malcolm X, but he was also assassinated in 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. He said, "Don't let anyone pull you so low as to hate them." And that's something we should all learn today. Thank God that someone like Martin Luther King was able to help. Martin Luther King Jr. was able to push our nation into a better way of doing things, into a state of equality. At the same time, during this era, the Vietnam War was kicking off. In fact, while JFK was still in office, he began sending troops to South Vietnam. In North Vietnam, they had a leader named Ho Chi Minh, who was using guerrilla warfare against South Vietnam with the assistance of the Red Chinese, the Communist Chinese, just like North Korea was being assisted in attacking South Korea by the Chinese. And America began to believe that and of course Ho Chi Minh was a communist, that if South Vietnam fell, other countries would start to fall to communism one after the other in like a domino effect. You know how dominoes work. One after the other. One knocks the other into communism. And these were lesser developed nations, and they were very, very, very susceptible to the communist ideal. And let me tell you something. We lost in Vietnam. We were forced to withdraw because we couldn't be as aggressive as we wanted to because, again, we didn't want to start a massive war with China. And so the communists were able to push forth their communist ideals, and a lot of countries fell to communism because of it. Most of Africa was at one time or the other a communist nation. But here's how it started in Vietnam. In the Gulf of Tonkin, communist guerrillas known as the Viet Cong, they were North Vietnamese communist guerrilla fighters, began terrorist tactics on South Vietnam. In 1964, they attacked U.S. Navy ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, and President Johnson asked Congress to increase the military presence there, which would put them at war with Vietnam. Congress refused to allow them to go on the offensive and invade communist North Vietnam. And Congress opposed any clear military victory. So we were basically fighting a war of stalemate with 500,000 soldiers in a no-win situation. The war was bad enough, but in 1968, the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese, went on a major offensive called the Tet Offensive. The Tet is kind of like the Vietnamese Christmas, New Year's holiday. And during Tet, when we thought it would be a peaceful time, they went on a massive offensive, and we fought several devastating, terrible battles in this Tet Offensive with heavy American casualties. This was a no-win situation from the beginning, and it just got worse. Unless we attacked North Vietnam, it was a no-win situation. We couldn't win. We weren't going to win no matter what we did unless we attacked North Vietnam. But if we attacked North Vietnam, then China would have gotten into the war. We stopped the communists from taking South Vietnam, so we were successful-ish in the Tet Offensive as in so much as we defended South Vietnam. But in the United States, this war was hated. When you talk to people about your paper that I've asked you to write, I want to hear their opinions on the war. It was mostly hated by Americans. Patriotism was at an all-time low. College campuses were filled with protests. A college nearby where I grew up called Kent actually had people die in protests. Communist sympathizers were on every college campus. Many people were opposed to the war. Musicians wrote songs against it. There were protests in every city, major city, and some of them got violent and deadly. Young people were burning flags. They were dodging the draft by becoming priests or running off to Canada. This was a hated and unwanted war in this country. There was also a counterculture revolution happening, where the young people were rising up and trying to express their own ideals in the country. One of the major counterculture factions were the hippies. I've lost my phone, folks. What time is it? The hippies didn't bathe. They wore dirty and ragged clothes. They listened to the music of the day. They expressed themselves through free love, which was sexual immorality. They thought that the government and society was supposed to provide for them, so they would steal what they wanted to a lot of times. Um, you know, they were mostly communists in ideals. They broke every code of polite society. They expected everything to be provided for them, and they contributed nothing to society. The hippies were a bad group um, of people in the era, and it's looked on with favor nowadays in history, but it just was not a good thing. Uh, in 1968, I think the hippies descended in the millions on the Haight Ashbury district of San Francisco and destroyed it. They took over any abandoned building. Um, they were stealing. They were doing protests. They were doing, love-ins and sit-ins, which are basically protests. At one protest, they had stolen a bunch of meat, turkey mostly, and made turkey sandwiches for the people at the sit-in. But before they passed them out, they laced the turkey with LSD. So everybody at this sit-in was tripping out of their heads on LSD, and it got terrible and violent. The hippie ideal was not a good one. Look up sometime the Tate LaBianca murders on on Wikipedia, and you'll understand that one of the a hippie cult leader, commune leader, named now I'm drawing a blank, Charles Manson, uh, convinced some of his members to go and murder a bunch of innocent people, including Sharon Tate and the LaBianca family, um, by mind control, basically. And there was a major trial for the whole thing. And Charles Manson, in my opinion, is considered one of the most evil men in history. You might find it interesting history to read about, though, the Tate LaBianca murders. Or ask your parents about them or grandparents about them and see what they have to say. I'm sure it would surprise you how terrible it was.